Welcome into another edition of the FutureSox RoundUp. My name is Elijah Evans, and I am joined, as always, by my co-host Jeff Cohen. We are back. The offseason is rolling, and this is an exciting time around Major League Baseball in general. We're a week removed, or 6 days removed, from the Garrett Crochet trade, which was kind of the first big domino for the White Sox this offseason. We knew it was coming. We did an instant reaction video, myself and Dylan Barnes, which you can go check out, kind of our just full thoughts on the trade right after it happened. Ian Eskridge and James Fox did a full kind of breakdown of the trade on their pod, the FutureSox podcast. So we're not going to dive too much into this trade, but because I haven't talked to Jeff about it yet, I do want to open up today by asking about that. And then we're going to dive into our main segment today, which is kind of how the offense lineups and rosters are going to be by each minor league affiliate. Last week, or to the last episode with Jeff and I, we broke down kind of the pitching rotations at each minor league affiliate level. And today we're going to go with the lineups and then the offensive roster of just kind of which prospects slot into each of the minor league rosters, who kind of makes the MLB team out of camp, combined with where the AAA team looks like. And then from there, what the AA, high A, and single A rosters are going to look like on the offensive side of the ball for the White Sox organization. So we've got a lot to cover today. First of all, Jeff, how are you doing?
Doing great, Elijah. Nice to see you again. Yeah, exciting time. You and all the other guys have talked about the trade in detail. So I will just say that I'm thrilled. You know, 2 top 50, top 75 prospects is a great return in this day and age. And, I'll be curious to see when there are other trades, if there's anything that even approaches something like this. I'd be shocked if anything else that happens in Major League Baseball brings this kind of return.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting. I mean, we did see the Kyle Tucker deal, so that's the one thing that was not quite the same return, but similar kind of tier, right, of an elite player, but Tucker with only 1 year of control versus Crochet with 2 years of control, kinds of similar in terms of a package return. But, this was a unique deal. I think no matter what, we talked about when we were doing mock trades, right, that the Red Sox made, I think, more sense than anyone. I think they always kind of did. I think they were the team that I had penciled down from the very start, is like, this is a very logical fit. It makes a lot of sense. They need their ace. And I think the second that Max Fried signed with the Yankees, it was like the Red Sox were like, okay, we got to go get our ace. And they did, and they went and got him, and they made it work, and they did it in a way where they didn't have to give up any of their top 3 guys, but at the same time, they were able to bring in, a Garrett Crochet level talent, and the White Sox still got 2 elite prospects and a handful of others who we're going to talk about in this episode as well, and we talked about last week. But in general, I think it's hard to fault the White Sox. I think they're, every deal you can pick some holes in, right? But I think in general, this was pretty good value for a guy that, is the Garrett Crochet is still somewhat of a question mark. I think he's a stud and he's an excellent pitcher. His numbers and all of his peripherals are excellent. But the White Sox probably weren't re-signing him, and they just got a lot more talent added to an already pretty good farm system.
And as we recalled during the Major League Draft, the speculation was that for the White Sox, it came down to either taking Montgomery or Grant Taylor, Hagen Smith. Those were among there might have been 1 or 2 others, but those were 2 of the guys they were considering. And they ended up getting both, essentially.
Yeah, Braden Montgomery was that guy, right? I mean, I think it was with Montgomery, he was in play for sure. And I think before his injury, he was even more in play. And now you get, 2 top 10 type players in the draft class that you've added to the system in the past few months now. So in addition to a guy in Kyle Teal that was a first rounder the year prior, right? So you basically got 2 more first round talents with the already really strong farm system. And on the hitting side, especially, right, you drastically improved the hitting side of this farm system. And now you're looking at a system with 6 guys that are clearly in the top 100 and 6 that are kind of all have a case for top 50 at this point, frankly, around that range at least, right? So you've got 6 high-end prospects now in this farm system, in addition to a bunch of other really solid ones too. So there's a lot to like. I feel pretty good about it. In the other kind of aspects of the offseason, what were your thoughts on Soto to the Mets or Fried to the Yankees or some of these other big deals we've seen go down? Tucker to the Cubs?
Well, a couple of thoughts. The Yankees clearly are not worried about bringing a lefty into Yankee Stadium. I mean, they did it with Carlos Rodon. They're doing it again with Fried. And they're willing to take a chance on guys who've had injuries in the past. So, good for them for being aggressive. Soto, wow. I guess at the end of the day, it just came down to the highest bidder, because if you want to win championships, you've got a much better chance with the Yankees than the Mets, simply because the American League is not nearly as competitive as the National League with the Phillies and Braves and Dodgers and Brewers and Padres. I mean, it's tough to come out of the National League make it to the World Series. So
I do agree with you. The National League is going to be a bloodbath this year when you look around that league for sure. At the same time, though, I think the Mets are, with their current ownership and with Steve Cohen, they're gonna push the chips. So I do see from Soto's perspective why it's like if you're going to be there the rest of your career, you feel pretty good about that organization finding a way to win consistently, considering how much they're going to be willing to spend, how much they're going to continue to push chips forward every year, kind of. So we'll see what happens, but it's a crazy deal. The amount of money is almost hard to even fathom for any player. I didn't think any player was going to top Shohei Ohtani's contract for a decade plus. Last year, if you asked me if anyone was going to hit $700 million for the next 5-10 years, I would have said no, because I just don't think any player is ever going to be more valuable than Shohei Ohtani. But here we are. Juan Soto signed for $765 million. Pretty crazy. So, let's get back to the White Sox, though. All these other teams spending money. The White Sox have never spent over $100 million on a player. That's the reality. That's the team we talk about. That's the team we're here to discuss. But the White Sox farm system looking pretty good. So we will start with the kind of major league roster / AAA, because I think, obviously these two rosters affect each other, right? Whichever prospects make the team out of camp, the other ones are going to be in AAA for the most part, of the top guys, at least the guys that are ready, nearly league ready, right? So for me, at the major league level, and I considered a few guys that aren't necessarily considered prospects still because they were up with the team last year, but I still kind of categorize them in that prospect bucket, right? So for me, the MLB roster, the guys that I think are breaking camp, it starts with Brian Ramos and Brooks Baldwin, because I do think both those guys are just kind of ready. I think they both got little cups of tea at the big league level last year, but I think they're going to come into camp, and if they have a strong camp, I don't see why either of those guys shouldn't break with the team. They're already on the 40-man. They've already played. They've already started their clock, right? I think those guys make it. I have two more prospects that I think make the MLB roster, and I'm curious to see if you have the same ones. I have Edgar Caro making the MLB roster. Caro breaks camp. I do. I think there's two catchers, and I think they're both going to get time this year in the big league level, but I think Caro did enough last year in AAA at the end of the season to show that he's just ready at this point, and that there should be one of these young guys making the team out of camp. Honestly, I don't see a reason to have it be Corey Lee and Chucky Robinson. I think one of these two young guys is going to make it, and I think it's going to be Edgar Caro. I think he's been there. I think they're familiar with him. I think they're ready. The second guy is Chase Meadroth, acquired from the Red Sox in the Gray Crochet trade. Meadroth is a guy that was mashing all year in AAA. You can take it with a grain of salt a little bit. AAA numbers can be inflated, especially in that league that he played in. But Meadroth is a versatile infielder. He's played some, all over the infield. He's probably a little bit, not rangy enough for a shortstop, but has played a good second base, has enough of an arm to get some reps at third. The White Sox have a busy third base, though. So I really do think Meadroth, along with Baldwin, are both going to get reps at second base, at potentially at shortstop as well. So I think Meadroth cracks the roster. Those are the four that I have making the major league roster. Where are you at with that?
who do you have as opening day shortstop?
I think Brooks Baldwin, honestly. I think it could be Baldwin, or I think it could be one of those, free agent fillers. But I think that ultimately, just to start the season, again, there's a very real world Colson makes the roster, and I do have that kind of marked down, but I think they give Colson a month or two in Charlotte. I could see it either way. Honestly, I could see it either way, because I think the incentive of having him up early is that he's eligible for that prospect promotion pick, right? So the White Sox could get an extra draft pick if somebody wins Rookie of the Year that starts the season with the team or up within a certain amount of days. So I could see it being Colson, but if Colson doesn't make the roster, I think it's a Baldwin at short and then a Meadroth starting at second.
Yeah, I like that. I like that a lot. I'm curious to see both of them in action. They're a little bit redundant, they're
Right.
probably at the end of the day going to both be depth pieces in the middle infield. So it'd be going to be interesting to see how that situation sorts itself out. And I don't have any argument with the four guys that you predict. I think they all have really good shots, and I'd love to see it. What about our buddy Tim Elko? They kept Andrew Vaughn, or at least they have so far.
Yeah.
So do you think that essentially blocks him?
I think it blocks him at first, just because if you want to Meadroth on the roster, if you want to try and get Miguel Vargas as many innings as possible, right? Vargas may play a little first. Vargas can play third. You've got Ramos playing third. You've then got Meadroth and Baldwin playing short second, right? Like, I think it's just a little messy right now. I do think there's a chance Elko. I had Elko and Colson both as those question mark guys, right? And then you've got, got Lenyn Sosa still in the picture, right? Like, there's a lot of guys that are still in the picture, even though it's kind of unclear. So I have Elko and Colson both starting in Charlotte, but with the assumption that those are both guys that would be up sooner than later. What did you have? Did you have Elko on the roster?
What I did not differentiate between
right.
who's in Chicago and who's in Charlotte.
It's tough. Yeah.
Yeah. So I had him on the list. he had a nice Arizona Fall League, but that does, it all comes down to spring. Number one, it comes down to spring. Number two, it comes down to, do they move Andrew Vaughn between now and opening day?
Right.
It doesn't appear that that's going to happen. We haven't heard any rumors about it. So yeah, he may be blocked for the time being. We'll see, but maybe he goes to Charlotte and hits his way back to Chicago.
Yeah, I agree. I think so. So in terms of the guys I also had listed, I had listed as Charlotte, but they kind of cross over right in that range, right? Kyle Teal, I think if Kyle Teal should be in Charlotte at the very least, right? So with Caro and Teal, I think those guys are going to be the catching tandem of the future. And I think even if they both play some other positions, but I think with Teal only played 20 something games in AAA. His numbers were much better in AA. So I think Teal starts in AAA. And I think he also starts in AAA with the idea of getting him some reps at other places. That's the thing with him. I think one of the big things with Teal is if you have him in AAA, you can afford with that roster to play him at first a little if Tim Elko goes up, or even if Tim Elko's there, Tim Elko can have a few days off. You can also get Teal some innings in the outfield, right? There's not a ton of guys in the outfield that you're really excited about at the Charlotte level, right? I've got Oscar Colas, Zach DeLoach, Cal Mitchell, who signed a minor league deal, all marked down as that kind of Charlotte group. But generally, Dominic Fletcher is kind of that in between. Is he in Chicago? Is he in Charlotte, right? All of those guys are going to get innings in the outfield, but I think there's room in Charlotte to get Teal some left field innings just to see kind of what it looks like out there. So I do think Kyle Teal will be there. Like all those guys I just mentioned, Oscar Colas, Zach DeLoach, Dominic Fletcher, Cal Mitchell, I all think they're kind of, pushing for a roster spot, but realistically, most of those guys are going to be in Charlotte. Nick Maton signed a minor league deal. I think he probably he has a chance to make the roster, but I do probably think he starts in Charlotte as well, plays some third base, especially if Ramos makes the roster, then Maton kind of has a third base opening clearly in Charlotte. Braden Shoemake, Lenine Sosa, one of them maybe makes the roster in Chicago. I don't think there's room for both of them in the roster in Chicago, especially if Meadroth makes the roster. So it's like one of those guys, maybe. Both those guys I kind of don't have any more interest in at this point, to be honest. I think there's a chance that either of them makes the roster, but I think they're both probably more, quad A players in terms of their career trajectory right now. So those are the guys I all had marked between Chicago and Charlotte.
So we've got Benintendi and Luis Robert for now, penciled in for left and center. So assuming they're both on the roster opening day, who else do you see in the outfield?
They signed. There's already been two signings, and they're both major league contracts. So Mike with Mike Tauchman and Austin Slater, I think that's pretty much the platoon at that point in right field. I think. There's a chance that things change, but I think both those guys are going to get regular innings. So I do see that kind of as the right field combo at that point. In which case, you maybe have one more outfielder on the roster, but that could be all the outfielders on the roster. In which case, all those other guys I mentioned would all be in AAA, right? So I think there's room for maybe a DeLoach or a Colas or somebody that can play first also. If you don't make Elko on the roster, then you can, if I would say, this is the way I would look at it. I say if there's no Elko, then there's maybe that fifth outfielder / first base combo, right? A guy that can play the corner outfields, but can also get some innings at first base. DeLoach and Colas have both got some innings at first base in the past. So I think that's maybe that last roster spot comes down to a pure first baseman hitter, DH guy like an Elko, or a outfield / first base / DH guy in a DeLoach and a Colas in a, that kind of category of player. So I think it's the four outfield spots are pretty locked at this point. So that last spot comes down to a fifth outfielder versus another infielder DH guy like an Elko.
Yeah, I think you're right. Whereas in the infield and behind the plate, there are a lot of guys who can envision being up there. It's not the case in Chicago, and that probably explains why the White Sox went out and picked up a couple of veterans, because they didn't see any obvious guys who were ready.
Right.
So I guess let's move on to Charlotte and see who that leaves us with. And
I think I kind of hit on everyone. Is there anybody else you had marked as more Charlotte guys?
Well, I brought up some guys from Birmingham for Charlotte.
I really didn't actually, which is funny because I feel like that Birmingham roster, and we can get to I want to hear who you brought up, because my thought was that Birmingham roster is still just a lot of those guys had just got there mid-season last year, because so many at the beginning of Birmingham last year were all getting moved up to Chicago and Charlotte, right? So my logic was that almost all those guys that finished the year in Birmingham only had a month or two there, right? So that was kind of my thought process of like a lot of the guys in Birmingham last year that finished out the year there, won that championship, I think will stay there to open the year. But I'm really curious, who are the guys that you brought up from Birmingham? Because I think I probably have them still in Birmingham.
Well, the first guy I brought up is Calvin Harris, just because he's older and needs to move quickly, and I think he would
over a Michael Turner.
Oh yeah, I meant to, yeah,
Because
you're right. I
because
meant
I had
Michael Turner.
yeah, okay.
Yeah,
Because I was
yeah,
gonna say Turner definitely in my eyes is ahead of Harris in
yeah.
the
That,
trajectory. Yeah,
Michael
yeah.
Turner. Yeah, I forgot. I got him reversed. Michael Turner. I think he's ready, and they need to move
I
quickly.
like that.
And even though there are a lot of catchers in Charlotte, with Hackenberg and I guess Carlos Perez, Chucky Robinson,
Nah.
I think Turner's got to get the playing time, and he will if they
It's
move
just
him
how
up.
is he getting playing time if Teal's there though? That's the question. But I guess if Teal plays other positions, you test him
Right.
out. Then you have Turner as that secondary guy. I could see that. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, and then the other guy I thought of was Jacob Gonzalez.
Hmm. I don't think so. I can see it, but I don't think so. I guess if Colson breaks camp with Chicago, then you have a real case to make for Gonzalez moving up that much. I think is that the logic you were kind of under? Is that if Colson's not there?
No, I really did it independent of Colson, and I
Hmm.
realize that's kind of foolish because you got your guys who are priorities at certain positions, and you find regular jobs for them. But again, he's older. He had an okay year in Birmingham. I guess my question to you is when is a guy ready to move up? If if or do you have him repeat an entire year at a level, regardless of his age or his pedigree? And I'll give you two examples in the lower levels that I wrestled with is Ryan Burrows and Wolkow. They both it started to click late in the year. So is that sufficient enough to move them another level
Hmm.
or bring
Hmm.
them back to
We'll get to
Kannapolis?
those exact ones when we get down to Canny or Winston and Canny, but I think it's a lot more than just you played a year at the level. I think there's a lot more that goes into development, and I think with some players they need multiple years at a level, not necessarily entire years, but need more than a year at a level to really see growth and to really channel that growth in the right direction, right? So I think there can be improvements made without it necessarily meaning players are ready for a bump, and that's how I view Gonzalez. Is like I do think Gonzalez did some good things. He had a really good playoff run with Birmingham, but I also think there was a lot of offensive aspects of his game that got pretty exposed in Birmingham last year, and that he looked like he was having at bats that weren't fully comfortable yet. So for that reason, I kept him in Birmingham, and I do think he's going to open in Birmingham again, just because I think there's still a lot for him to work through as a player. So it's going to be interesting. But it's an interesting point to consider for you there. It's that it's like, what is being ready to go up mean? And that's obviously a huge aspect of major league development and just what goes on in a farm system in general, at every level of the farm system.
And let's say hypothetically that Gonzalez opens in Birmingham and his year is pretty much identical to last year. Times he shows flashes and there are a lot of times he struggles. Do you leave him there all year?
No, I think it just depends. I think it's you eventually you have to push a guy, but you don't have to push a guy just because he did a year there, right? So like at the 1 year point, it's like, okay, if he really struggled at the level, let's give him another year there and let him work through things. Once you get to 2, 3 years at a level for a guy, or even 2 years at a level for a guy, especially for a first round pick, you kind of have to push them at some point. So I feel like it's like you find that if he gets hot for a week or two, you say, okay, let's go. Like at some point, you have to have a little bit more of an aggressive timeline, but I don't think it's off the bat for a guy like Gonzalez quite yet, just because I think there was a lot that he was still struggling with at the plate in Birmingham last year.
Okay. All
Who
right.
else?
That's pretty much it.
I like the Turner idea. I actually didn't have Turner down, and I definitely think I probably agree with that. I think it depends on if they keep a Hackenberg or a Chucky Robinson on the roster, right? I think it kind of that could change some things, right? And it depends obviously if Caro makes the roster. If Caro doesn't make the roster, it doesn't make Chicago out of camp, then
Right.
obviously Turner wouldn't come up to Charlotte quite yet. But I think if Caro does make Chicago, I think there's a very good case that Turner to be in Charlotte. So I like that one.
And you're right. Kyle Teal is a factor. What are their plans for him?
Right.
Um, sure. Okay.
Yeah. All right, let's go down to Birmingham then, because I'm curious to see who you had then filling those guys that you bumped up, because I didn't have that. So do you want to go? Do you take your Birmingham, your kind of roster and your offensive guys in Birmingham first, and then I'll piggyback off what you go with.
All right. Well, I'm going to start my Birmingham roster by talking about who I have bumped up from Winston-Salem. And again, this goes back to the discussion we just had is when is a guy ready? Like, for example, Wes Kath, how long does he have to be in Winston before you say, all right, let's see what he can do in Birmingham? I promoted him to Birmingham. I promoted Eddie Park, even though he didn't have the greatest year in Winston. I promoted William Bergola. He had a good year combined with Philadelphia and Winston. And I promoted Caden Connor.
Yeah. Okay, interesting. I like most of those overall. I did not promote most of those guys. I think I was a little more conservative with you, so it's interesting. It's good for both of us to have the different perspectives here because I definitely was more conservative with the upper level guys because I think there is a sneaky amount of depth in this system, right? So I like that you did the promotions because I'm going to now do my lineup because I kind of crafted the lineup here where I had Calvin Harris at catcher in Birmingham / Michael Turner if he doesn't get promoted. Originally I had Michael Turner, but I kind of like your Michael Turner in Charlotte idea. So Calvin Harris / Michael Turner in Birmingham. First base, I had Sean Gusenberg remaining there at first base, kind of similar to last year, with DJ Gladney also mixing in at first base. I think DJ Gladney's going to start to get some first base innings because I don't think there's as much depth at first base as a lot of the other guys. So I see Gladney kind of starting to get a little bit of reps at first base, or potentially Wilfred Veras as well. I had Rikui Nishida and Mario Camilletti as the second base kind of duo, both of them being second base / utility guys. I think they both looked good on promotion last year. I think they both remain there. They were only there for a handful of games, so I don't see either of them going further, but I think they'll both be regular players in Birmingham. I have Jacob Gonzalez at shortstop, remaining in Birmingham for another year. I did have Wes Kath with you, though, right there with you. I don't think there's anybody else that's going to play third base in Birmingham unless it's, just a free agent guy like a Nick Pognell who I got picked up last year off waivers, right? So, I think Kath gets a chance. I think he's had enough in Winston, and even though he did struggle last year, showed enough signs of development where you can say, he's been there for 2 years. Let's just see it in Birmingham. So I did have Kath at third base, and then in the outfield, I had Terrell Tatum, Wilfred Veras, DJ Gladney, and then combination of Matt Hogan, Rikui Nishida. So pretty much the same lineup there for me as the end of last season with the additions of Wes Kath and Calvin Harris catching. But basically everything else I kept pretty status quo personally in Birmingham because I think there's a lot of guys there that still have things they need to do to be ready for the next step.
And I will say some of my promotions were the result of just running out of roster spots in Kannapolis and West.
Right. No, 100%. That's completely fair. And I have a few spots in those lineups where I'm like, these are kind of just like question mark guys because I don't know exactly where they're going to play or where they're going to go because that's exactly right. So I understand those promotions. The Eddie Park one makes sense for that reason, but I also don't think he's quite shown enough either. So, I get the idea of those promotional. Anybody else on that Birmingham roster that I didn't mention that you had there?
The one other guy I had was Loedel Chapelli.
Yeah, Leodel Chapelli.
Leodel Chapelli, because they skipped with him. He went from the DSL to Arizona, skipped Canny, went right to Winston. So I guess they see something there.
Yeah, I'm not sure Chapelli even makes a roster, to be honest. I wouldn't be surprised if he gets cut in the earlier parts of the parts of spring training. I mean, I think he could, but I don't. I think he was, once a pretty heralded international prospect, and I just don't see there hasn't been really any signs of development. Last year, he was really just a utility player at that point. So I think he probably remains in Winston as a utility player just for depth at that point, or he might just be let go of. Honestly, I'm not sure Chapelli really has much more time left in the organization, unfortunately.
Yeah, I don't see him getting playing time, whether it's Winston or Birmingham, but
yeah, exactly. It's just hard. I mean, like we said, this system is a lot deeper. I was putting together these lineups and I was like, there's pretty good depth at a lot of positions. There's a few positions where it's not as much, right? But even something like the outfield, right? Where the outfield is something that we talked about last year, even where it was there was a lot of kind of empty spots in the outfield where it's what does that look like? And now it's there's a lot of guys in the outfield that are all going to need innings. And it's where do these innings go? How do you find innings for, a handful of guys? There's guys on this list that I didn't really know where to put them. And I have 4 outfielders listed at each level. And I still think there's a few other outfielders that I have in my head that I'm I don't know where that guy fits in really right now with all the other guys that are going to need innings this year. So
I agree. It's tricky. So it gets tougher, I think, when you go to Winston.
Yeah, I was going to say going down to Winston. I'm going to go first here at the Winston lineup, and then I'm going to get your take, and then we'll flip back for the Canny and do the opposite there. Winston is interesting because there's a lot of guys from Canny that I think you can make a case could be in Winston, but there's also a lot of guys that still need some more innings under their belt and still kind of haven't really proven themselves quite yet. So the way I did it with Winston, catching, I had Jackson Appel. I think Jackson Appel is too experienced, too advanced as a catcher to be in Kannapolis. I think he's going to be the starting and basically the primary catcher in Winston. I think there'll be some depth guys there. Of course, Weston Eberle is probably a depth guy. Kobe Smelly could be a depth guy, right? But I think Jackson Appel is the clear starter catcher in Winston. And then first base, I had a platoon kind of Bryce Willits and Ryan Galaney. I think both of them still need more. I think also Caden Connor could be in that mix. I kind of like your idea of Connor being in Birmingham. I'm just not sure he showed quite enough yet, but maybe just because of his age and his experience, he could be in Birmingham. So I had Connor penciled in as more of just a utility piece at either Birmingham or Winston. But Willits, Galaney at first base. I had Bergoya at second base. I don't think Bergoya is ready quite yet for Birmingham. I don't mind the idea. I think for you it makes sense because if Jacob Gonzalez goes up, I think Bergoya then would maybe be the case to go up to Birmingham, right? But I do think Bergoya starts in Winston. I think he's just young still, and because he's new to the organization, I think they want to keep him there a little bit longer. Shortstop in Winston, Sam Antonacci. Gotta be Sam Antonacci. Sam Antonacci has absolutely nothing to prove in Kannapolis. Frankly, I wouldn't even hate seeing Sam Antonacci go straight to Birmingham, honestly. I think he's just such an advanced hitter for his age and his status right now coming out of the draft. We saw him last year. I mean, when me and you were in Kannapolis last summer and we talked to him and we saw him, it was just clear that he's already better than Kannapolis. It was just so obvious. So he's the starting shortstop for me in Winston, but would not be surprised to see him get some reps in Birmingham or even make the Birmingham roster, honestly. Third base, I had Galaney getting some innings. I had Jordan Sprinkle getting some innings there as well. I think Sprinkle will get some backup innings at shortstop, maybe at third base. And then in the outfield, I have Braden Montgomery, new addition. I think he skips over Kannapolis. Even coming off an injury, I'm not sure I see Braden Montgomery needing Kannapolis. I think he starts in Winston, and I think he gets the majority of the season there before heading to Birmingham at some point in the season. And then Casey Sauke, who was there last year, started his minor league career there, didn't have enough innings or quality to get bumped up yet. Eddie Park as well, who also was in Winston last year coming out of the draft. And then Samuel Zavala repeats the year in Winston. I don't think he did nearly enough to be ready for the next level as well. So Zavala, who I still a really young prospect. I think people forget how young Samuel Zavala is. Plenty of time for him to continue to develop, but I think it's going to remain in Winston. And then kind of Caden Connor as that last utility piece for me.
Okay. So I was a little more aggressive again, in part because of all the guys I saw needing to play in Canny. So I went ahead and bumped George Walkout up to Salem, and I bumped Ryan Burrows, and I bumped Ronnie Hernandez to be Jackson Appel's backup.
I would be pretty shocked if any of those guys were not in Candy, to be honest. That's just my take. I like the aggression, though. I think it's definitely interesting. I just think with so many new draft picks, especially from that 2024 class, and so many college draft picks, right? A lot of this draft class was experienced college players. I can't see the White Sox having a reason or a need to push those teenagers, right? All three of those guys are still teenagers, right? Yeah. I have a hard time envisioning any of the teenagers making that Winston roster, considering the depth at all those positions we were mentioning.
My feeling is that they'll definitely spend the entire year there and probably some of the next year. So instead of getting a year and a half in Canny, I see them getting a year and a half in Winston-Salem. But in the case of Ryan Burrows, for example, I mean, part of that was because I'm assuming Javier Mogollon and Caleb Bonnemer, and some of these other really good middle infielders are coming up right behind them.
Yeah, I don't dislike the Burrows idea. It's just hard to justify a bump when he's still so young and really struggled last year. It's I don't know. I mean, most of the season last year, he was still really struggling through some hitting adjustments and working on his swing and all those different things. And it's good positive growth, but I can see that one a little bit more. Walco, I think no chance. I will say, I don't think there's any world. I just think the White Sox view him way too highly to push him at all. I think they're going to be really patient with him. And because the upside he has, he had some good signs, but he's got to kind of still work through those swing and miss issues, through the strikeouts, right? There's some things he still needs to figure out. And I do think it's going to take some time for him to get there. And I don't think they're going to want to push him past Winston or past Candy, especially when you have so many college outfielders from the past two drafts that you need to get innings in. And with Braden Montgomery now coming, Braden Montgomery being the way more clear kind of right field option. Braden Montgomery is going to be the everyday right fielder, I think, in Winston. Wherever Walco is, he needs to get innings every single day. And I don't think there's innings for him every single day in Winston.
Okay. Well, let's see who you've got because you did it positionally. So let's see who your
Yeah,
lineup is in Kannapolis. I'm curious how this shakes out, given all the guys who were drafted last year. Who,
right.
yeah, a lot of
Right.
outfield.
So it's tricky. And that's why I don't blame you at all for pushing some of these younger guys because it is really hard to fit everybody in the roster. But I do think the White Sox are going to have a handful of guys that remain in the Arizona Complex League out of the bat, right? I think there's a good number of guys like the younger, like Bonnemer, right? Who I think Bonnemer is going to spend a good amount of time in the Arizona Complex League. I think he's incredibly talented, but I just don't think they need to push it yet. So maybe, I mean, to be honest, when I look at the Winston, now you're getting me a little bit sold on the Burrows idea, just because there is that third base spot, and even if Sam Antonacci's in Winston, right, you've got kind of innings to spare at third base, or behind a Galaney, right, or platooning with a Bergoya, right. So maybe that happens. But what I had in Canny was Rony Hernandez splitting the catching duties with Steven Flores. I don't know how much you know about Steven Flores. Steven Flores was an Arizona Complex League Dominican guy who was incredible in the Dominican Complex League in 2023, and then Arizona Complex League all of last year, and was not great, but is definitely, after spending a whole summer in the Arizona League last year, is probably someone who's ready to be in Canny. So I have him kind of being the backup to Rony. I think Rony needs a little more time there to craft the defense more than anything. And I think with having guys like, now Teal and Turner, Harris, Appel, Eberle all ahead of him, right? Like they just don't need to rush Rony. Like the catching depth is really, really strong. We've talked about this. Like there is serious catching depth. So with a Jackson Appel in Winston, I think Rony can stay in Canny for at least half the season probably. And then I have Amac, Anthony Makowitz, and Lyle Miller Green splitting the first base duties, kind of platooning there at first base. I have Joral Perez remaining as the primary second baseman. And I basically have a three-way platoon with Joral Perez at second base, Alexander Albertus, and Javier Mogollon at the middle infield spot. So I kind of think those three are going to be the main. They're all going to get chances at shortstop. I think Albertus is, I think Mogollon maybe, I don't know. All of them are probably second baseman long term. That's why I think Burrows on that roster helps, because those guys rotate around second base with some shortstop, maybe a little third base. And then I had Burrows playing a lot of third base because those guys are kind of going to be taking a lot of the middle infield reps there. But I could see that kind of either way. And then the outfield, I had George Welko, and then a bunch of the draft picks: Nathan Archer, Nick McLean, TJ McCants, and then potentially Cole McConnell as well in the outfield there in Kannapolis.
Yeah, and a big question mark that I really have no idea who all is in Arizona and what their timetable is.
Exactly.
We don't know. League, who the free agents are.
100%. Yeah, no, it's hard to gauge that, and that's not something we're going to know for a while. But I mean, Bonnemer is going to be there sooner than later, though. Everybody we talked to this summer loves Caleb Bonnemer, and everybody I've talked to is super pumped on him. So I do think there's a world where Bonnemer does make that roster, but I think he probably starts in Arizona and then quickly makes his way into that roster, because even the guys I mentioned, right, like Bonnemer especially, yes, he's a shortstop, but especially the idea of him being, a potential third baseman too. I think there's still a possibility that if he kind of bulks up, that he could be a third base option, right? There's really nobody at third base. I mean, Arxie Hernandez is the other guy I had written down in Kannapolis. He probably doesn't need to be in Canny anymore, so maybe he gets those third base reps in Winston instead of a Galaney, right? Galaney could just stick at first base DH kind of. But I think with Arxie, if Arxie moves up, then you've got a real clear opening for Bonnemer at shortstop / third base in Kannapolis with, it just is tricky with Perez, Albertus, and Mogollon, who all are kind of second basemen, but could play some short. So maybe Joral Perez gets the bump up to Winston earlier than I expect. He's just so young. He just turned 20 last week, or a few weeks ago. He just turned 20. So it's like, he's just super young still, or he just turned 19, maybe, I think. Whatever he is, he's young for sure. No, he just turned 20. So maybe Joral Perez gets a bump, but I do think that's kind of how it shakes out. It's really hard to project, though, when you don't know who could still stay back in Arizona for a little bit longer.
Right.
And then you've got all those college outfielders, right? Like an Archer, McLean, McCants. They all need innings, right? They're all draft picks from this past year who all need innings. But I just don't think any of those guys necessarily prove that they're ready for the bump just yet, at least in the same way that, Sam Antonacci did, for example.
Yeah, and again, it's yet another area of player development that's tricky. You've got these older college guys in Kannapolis, and then you've got, like you said, the Wolkows and the Burrows, these 18, 19-year-old kids who've got more playing time in Kannapolis. It's so, what trumps what in terms of who gets the promotion first to Winston, just to create playing time for everyone.
Yeah, 100%. It's hard for sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's interesting. Who else do you have kind of on that roster? Any differences from me?
Not really that much different. I tried to figure out, who was in Arizona some guys like, do they bring Edric Felix back, even though if they do, he, will be on the bench. And Adrian Gill is a guy I've heard about from the DSL. Curious to see what's up with him. Nick McLean, I don't know, maybe.
Yeah, I have McLean and Kenny as one of those outfielders because I think he's ready. I mean, McLean's the guy that I think is even higher upside than a lot of those other college guys, right? Like he was drafted in the third round. It was a highly touted prospect. He was just coming off an injury last year in college and then kind of didn't get any innings under his belt at the end of the season. He played in Arizona for a little while, but he didn't get any minor league innings. So if McLean got a handful of innings last year, I think he would have been one of the Winston guys, honestly. I just think because he didn't get any innings, he probably does open up the season in Kannapolis still. But it's a fun roster. I mean, I think there's both those young two. I mean, the high A and single A rosters are a lot of guys that we are excited to see. It's just a matter of how they shake out and who really kind of pulls ahead in the early months of the season, because any of the guys in those two rosters could bounce between the others or even move up further if they really start the season strong, given how many. There's a lot of options. It's a good thing, especially with the outfield. One of the things I really noticed with this, I think it was very intentional additions made to the outfield in trades and the last two drafts. And that's something that, was needed, right? This team needed a lot of outfield help. If you look at the roster or the organizational roster, a year or two ago, right? Since then, you've added Samuel Zavala in trade. You've added Brady Montgomery in trade. You've added, via the draft, you've added Sauke, Park, Walco, Archer, McLean, McCants, right? Like there's a lot of guys, Rakui, right? Like they have really, really done a good job overhauling the outfield depth. And I think that shows at each of these levels where I have 4 or 5 outfielders that all need innings at each level, basically.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm just sitting here thinking one more draft like these last 2 or 3, and there's every reason to think that they will be with the same kind of depth. There are going to be a lot of good guys who are going to have to be dropped or moved to the bench. I mean,
there's a lot of, that's one thing I noticed looking through some of the rosters. Like there is going to have to be a lot of cuts made and a lot of guys that are, either cut or just kind of depth bench pieces, right? There's guys that we considered to be, pretty solid prospects at one point and are good players by all means that just haven't shown enough in the past year or two to deserve playing time over these new draft picks and over these new trade guys, right? Like it's hard to find innings for players, even if they were once, valued members of the organization, right? Like it's hard to find innings for guys from like one guy that I wanted to mention, Jacob Burke. Like Jacob Burke was excellent in 2023, but you look around the outfield and it's like, where does Jacob Burke get innings? I don't really know. Like maybe it's Birmingham. I think he maybe goes back. He was in Birmingham the year before and then he got here last year and he got bumped back down to Winston, right? So like maybe it's Birmingham. He gets innings instead of Matt Hogan, but Matt Hogan was pretty decent last year, right? Like even those are guys that we aren't considering as prospects necessarily, or top prospects at least, but have shown a lot. And Jacob Burke, deserves to get innings somewhere. I don't know where that inning comes from. Like where does that come from? I don't know.
Yeah. And you don't want to pull the trigger too soon on some of these guys.
Right.
Because, we've seen guys flash, who are 15th round picks before, right? And so,
100%.
Give him every opportunity.
Even a guy like Albertson Asagan was a guy that was like pretty decent at times last year for Kannapolis.
Yeah.
But at the same time, he just turned 23 years old this winter, and like a 23-year-old in single A, high A, like compared to the rest of these guys in the system, there's really not that much he can do to prove him and get rostered playing time at this point, right? So we'll see how it shakes out, but there is a lot of depth. The way I want to finish this with you, now that we've kind of gone through this, we did the pitching last week, we did the hitting. I think maybe we'll talk about some key bullpen guys in the next week or two, which we don't have to go make the whole bullpen. Maybe we'll talk about some guys at each level that are worth watching in the bullpen. After this Red Sox trade, and now that we kind of have really gone through each level, where do the White Sox rank in Major League Baseball in terms of farm system? Because it's got to be pretty high up there right now. I mean, you've got 6 consensus top 100 prospects, arguably 7, maybe 8 on a few other sites, right? Consensus 6, though, in addition to a much deeper system, some really good drafts recently, it's up there.
Yeah. I need to take a closer look at all the top 20s. I was looking at I was looking recently at the White Sox top 30, and the top 10 is just deadly. It's just
for sure.
So strong.
I mean,
But then 11 through 30, I could, there's 20 spots. I could come up with another 20 players who you could throw in there.
Right. And you could mix and match. And it's hard to gauge exactly where a lot of those guys lay. But I think there's still just a lot of talent, right? Like there's a lot of talent at each level. Like when you've got a guy like, Joral Perez, for example, or, who was acquired in the trade, or, Blake Larson, who was a top high school drafted, Caleb Bonnemer, right? When those are guys that are in your 15 to 25 range, right? Like 10 to 25 range, right? Like you've got some serious depth in a system if you've got guys with that type of upside that are in your middle range of the system and aren't even considered in that top tier, right?
Right. Yeah. So from 15 to 25, God, oh my gosh. I mean, we could just fill it just with 2024 draft picks, right?
Right. Pretty much. I mean,
TJ McCants and
some of those guys are lower picks and are still a little more question mark there for sure.
Right.
But yeah. I mean, so looking at MLB, this is MLB.com from August. MLB.com from August had the White Sox farm system listed as, let's see, they had it listed as actually interesting. 11 in baseball, which I think was again that was pre some trades. I think actually no, this was after the trade deadline. That's weird. I don't agree with that. I think it was already top 10 to be honest. But now, even if it was, let's say it was 11, right? It's ranked as 11 on MLB.com from August, right? So being ranked as 11 in August, since then, right? I think you can say, I mean, there's some teams ahead, but like guys are graduating, right? Like the Nationals were ahead of them. Dylan Cruz is about to graduate, right? Like their only top prospect is about to graduate. They only have 2 other guys in the top 100. I think you can safely pass them. Mariners, still a very strong system, I'd say. I think it's kind of similar type of tier. The Cubs just traded one of their top prospects in Cam Smith, but I still think it's a pretty good system, probably on par. The Red Sox, right? It's listed ahead, but the Red Sox just traded 2 of their top 5 guys to the White Sox, right? So I think you could put the White Sox ahead of the Red Sox at this point. Yeah, they have a big 3, but I think the White Sox system is better overall than the Red Sox, right? Then you get to a Dodgers. The Dodgers system is always going to be elite, but I'd say the White Sox have more top-end talent right now, to be honest. And then you look at, Guardians. Guardians is probably similar type of tier. I think there's a lot of talent there. Baltimore, though, Baltimore's graduated a lot of their guys, right? Like they still have, Jackson Holiday, Kobe Mayo, Samuel Basayo, but they've graduated a lot of guys, and then Jackson Holiday is already up in the big leagues now. There's a case that the White Sox are in kind of that top 5 range now. I think there's a very real case you can make for the White Sox being in the top 5 systems, or at least around that area.
Yeah, and I think I think clearly they've got a strong top 10, and all the top teams in baseball have strong top 10 minor leaguers. I think the real question comes down to 11 through 20.
Right. Who hits? Who really, becomes big in that group? Yeah.
Right. Who's just got a lot of depth? Like I would say Milwaukee does, but God, I'm looking at a lot of other teams, and I think we definitely hold. We are definitely as good as many of these teams.
Yeah, 100%. I think. I mean, if you're in a 10, if you're looking at let's take out the top tier, right? The top tier that features all those guys we talked about, the top 6, and then the top tier still features George Walkout, Grant Taylor, Jairo Uriarte, right? Mason Adams, even, right? Take out those guys. When you look at the middle of a system and you see Caleb Bonnemer, Chase Meadroth, who's going to maybe start an opening day like we talked about, Jacob Gonzalez, Brian Ramos, Joral Perez, Alexander Albertus, William Bergoya, Blake Larson, Aldrin Batista, who we love. Like there's a lot of guys in that range that are really, really solid prospects, honestly.
Yeah. I'm looking at it compared to the Dodgers. I think that, and that's a tough comparison.
Of course, a tough comparison. Yeah, but I think it's in a similar tier for sure.
Yeah, I would have to think like what, somewhere 5, 6, 7.
I think it's borderline. It could be considered up to 3 even. I think it depends. It depends on a few more moves. I think the Sox, if the White Sox trade Luis Robert this offseason, though, even if it's an undervalued package, right? If they get 1 or 2 big prospects back for Luis Robert, then you're looking at maybe number 1. I'm not going to lie.
No, God, I'm sitting here looking at top 20 lists, and I'm really kind of underwhelmed by a lot of these teams. That, yeah.
It's interesting to consider, but I hope this was helpful for people to kind of get a perspective on the depth at each level and the positional, how people are ranking, what we're looking for. So it's going to be really interesting to see where the roster goes. I think obviously the first step is determining the big league roster, and then everything kind of trickles down from there. So come spring training, I think it'll be very fascinating to see how the big league roster shakes out, because that'll very clearly affect both Charlotte and Birmingham. And then on the lower levels, you have kind of its own separate figuring out process in minor league spring training. I'm fired up for Arizona. I wish I could go tomorrow. I will be there for a week in March, and I am so excited to be, probably more excited to be on the backfields watching the minor league stuff than anything else, to be honest, because that's what we love talking about, and that's what I love seeing. So I'm really excited to see kind of where that minor league system shakes out and how everything looks at the lower levels of the system too.
Well, you mentioned that to me last week, and I've since floated it past my wife. So I'm laying the foundation for.
There we go. We will see. That would be awesome.
But let's wrap up with this. I got a question for you. Let's talk about who you see, and I think you already mentioned him, but maybe two or three guys who you see as being really fast movers through the system.
Ooh, that's a good question. I think Sam Antonacci is the clear number
Right.
one. I
Right.
think he is going to fly. I really think his contact skills, even if the total impact isn't quite there yet, his contact skills are going to make him fly. I think he's in. If you told me he is in Charlotte this season, I wouldn't be that surprised, honestly. As crazy as that may sound for a 5th round draft pick who, just got drafted last year, like I could see him being in Charlotte this year. Honestly, I really could. I think he's the clear guy that pops up in my head. Let me think of who other fast movers. Interesting. I mean, is Nishida qualified, right? I think Nishida's already been a fast mover, right? I think at some point it's like Rakui's a guy that's such an impact, a cannon, right? Where it's like, you got to consider him being in Charlotte at some point this season. And that's already quick moving. And, maybe he's an MLB guy at the end of the season. And because it's like, where do you I don't know what his profile is at the big league level, but at what point do you just have to keep pushing it and see what happens? Right. So I think he's another guy I think of. Who are the other guys at some of the lower levels? I mean, Brady Montgomery, right? I think that's the other clear answer is Brady Montgomery. I think if Montgomery comes out and he's healthy and he looks like the college version of himself at the beginning of the season in Winston, which I think we both had him in Winston, that's a guy that could easily be in Charlotte by the end of the season as well.
Yeah, and you mentioned Jackson Appel. I was
so
impressed with him. Yes. I could see him moving, except for the fact of the catching depth.
Yeah. I could see him passing Calvin Harris, though, honestly. I wouldn't be shocked if he passed Calvin Harris in terms of the organizational depth chart, because we haven't seen a ton of production from Harris at this point so far in his first year of professional ball. So it wouldn't shock me to see Appel kind of jump Harris in the organizational depth at the catchers. But I do agree he could move quickly if not for the other guys in the system already, too.
Yeah. That's probably about it for me.
Yeah. There's probably some others. I think Nick McClain's another good one. I think Nick McClain, if Nick McClain looks like I think he could look, and I really liked when I dove in and I got to interview him and talk to him. I really liked a lot of the things that he's about and the way he plays the game and kind of what he brings from a well-rounded perspective. I could see McClain now that he's fully healthy, jumping from Canny to Winston and probably even to Birmingham next year.
So I got, I can keep going all day with this. Yeah. One more question. I'm curious to see if you agree with me as to where the most depth is in terms of non-pitchers. What positions? I kind of think, we've got a lot of interesting catching depth, but middle infield is
there's a lot of depth. Yeah, I think when you factor in Bonnemer too, I think middle infield is when you factor in a Bonnemer and you factor in Mogollon coming from the ACL, and there's a lot of depth up and down. But I also think you could argue middle infield could be somewhat of a weakness considered at the upper levels, right? Aside from a Coulson, right? So it's like, I think probably that's right. But I also think there's sneaky a lot of outfield depth, especially at the lower levels. Outfield depth is really good at the lower levels right now. At the upper levels, it's a huge question mark, and that's the reason the White Sox already signed 2 outfielders to play right field this year. But and AAA doesn't look great, and even AA is a little iffy there too. But I think the lower level outfield depth is also really strong as well.
Well, you're right about middle infield depth. After Coulson, there's a lot of pressure on
a lot of question marks. A lot of question marks for sure. But when you have an Antonacci quickly rising, and then you added a Bergoya and Herrall and Albertus and Mogollon and now Bonnemer, right? Like you added so many guys in that younger core of middle infielders as well. So there's a lot of all over, honestly. Really curious to see who sticks out at third base, because I don't think there's a single spot you can pick at third base that's like, ooh, that's exciting. I think there's some guys that are solid. I mean, we talked about Wes Kath and we talked about, the potential of Burrows playing some third, right? But like, there's nobody that really jumps out at me at third base. So I'm kind of curious to see. Obviously, you're hoping Miguel Vargas or Brian Ramos click at third base. One of those guys clicking at third base would be the key. But third base depth down the chart is going to be interesting to see who could maybe shift there or who they could look to add still at third base potentially.
I'm hoping Burrows sticks at short, because I think he's one of the best defensive shortstops.
It's just there's just a lot of guys there. There's a lot of guys there, like we just talked about.
I think he's got one of the best gloves. So.
Yeah, no, I would agree. So that'll be interesting. All right. Well, that will do it for this edition of the Roundup. We hope you enjoyed. This was a fun one. We're getting excited. It's the middle of December right now. We're 2 weeks out from the new year, in which case we're going to be really rolling. And that's going to be super exciting. So I'm pumped. I'm excited to see where things take us. And it's going to be a really fun rest of the off season. So we'll keep you updated, and we'll be back sometime soon.
All right. Thanks, Happy Jeff. Thanksgiving.
Yeah. Happy Thanksgiving. You're one holiday off.
Yeah,
we're close. Right. But happy holidays to everyone, and we will talk to you soon.
Edit that out.
Talk to you.